All right. So, in our previous class, as I said, we discussed the Christian medieval political theory, ideas of St. Augustine, and we were discussing the ideas of St. Aquinas. So, when we were talking about Aquinas, we talked about his two ideas of, the way in which law binds. One is the directive way, and then other, is the coercive way. The king is bound only in a directive sense, but it is not bound by by the law in a coercive sense, right? So, what effect does this idea have on the idea of legitimacy of rulers, as was expounded by Aquinas, right? Um, Aquinas thought that there are two sorts of defects that can happen in a ruler's rule. First is an invalid claim to the throne, and second is unjust rule, right? So invalid claim is basically where the ruler is neither chosen by the people nor is a rightful successor for previous rule, right? And the subjects in these cases do not need to obey the laws of the ruler, right? Which is a big deal. um, and second is of course justice, right? The if the human law that is propounded by the by the ruler is not in conformity with the natural law as informed from as inferred from the eternal law, in this case the ruler's rule is unjust. Now the perception of natural law and human law, I mean, natural law is different here from the natural laws of, let's say, earlier natural law thinkers like Cicero, right? Cicero believed that there is no separate law in Athens and there's no separate law in Rome. There is only one eternal law, that is the natural law, which flows everywhere and which is perceptible by reason, right? Now Aquinas was faced with this question: okay, if natural law is based on reason and reason is universal, how do you explain the fact that different places have different laws? And it's, I mean, are you saying that the laws of always the laws of some cities are unjust just by the virtue of the fact that they are so different? Aquinas says no, that is not the case, because of difference in circumstances, right? Different circumstances provide us with different premises from which we perceive in our reasoning, and hence the natural law of different cities and different states is different. So this is how Aquinas tries to sort of maintain consistency with his idea of natural law, right? And the very powerful idea that if this natural law, the human law, does not conform with the natural law, then the rule of the ruler is unjust, and by virtue of that there is no necessity to obey by the words of these rulers. In his book Summa Theologica, Aquinas states, man is bound to obey secular princes insofar as this is required by the order of justice. Wherefore, if the prince's authority is not just but usurped, or if he commands what is unjust, his subjects are not bound to obey him, except perhaps except perhaps accidentally, in order to avoid scandal or danger. Now, he's presenting here a very radical claim, right? And he goes on to say that he whoever liberates their countries by killing a tyrant should be praised and rewarded, right? So in this sense the king is below the law in the directive sense, right? So what Thomas here, like Thomas Aquinas, is doing here, he's providing sort of grounds for revolution, right? And this sort of breaks away from the classic medieval political theory, right? And although of course, Thomas Aquinas was a moderate thinker, so he was not living in a time that he could challenge the authority of the church, but he sort of laid the groundwork for further thinkers to come and to do the things that he could not do. Essentially, his idea was basically the integration of reason with faith, right? To say that they are not different and there's no reason why faith should shun reason, right? And he of course uses Aristotle to a great extent in this, and we see that many of the church scholars sort of uses Aristotle as an authority to defend reason. And that is why Aristotle is one of the towering figures even in medieval times, because he was the one who sort of holding the edifice of reason even when the faith was sort of taking over as a dominant way of thinking. Like, okay, so this is of course very different from the idea that was that I described as the divine right theory in some senses, that which was the absolute divine right theory, which the likes of Pope Boniface VIII professed, which sort of said that kings serve in the fear of Jesus Christ and are the vessels of the church, right? Now, Aquinas, on the other hand, was trying to claim that the kings and churches have a very formal and legal relationship, and the church does not have sovereignty over the state, right? So here we are presented a very different view of the relationship between church and state, which sort of laid the, like gave room for the development of what we later refer to as constitutionalism, right? Now, what Thomas Aquinas did was he said that um, the authority of the government is limited, right? But it is not limited by the church, it is limited by God and reason, right? But it is very different from saying that the authority of the church is limited by the law, which was constitutionalism. This is the idea of constitutional, right? The authority of the sovereign political power, whatever, is limited by the law. And sort of that took ground because of the theory of, Aquinas and later Aristotelian theorists like Marcellus of Padua. But of course, some historical context is important as to development of these ideas. In the year 1187, the Sultan Saladin of Ayyubid dynasty captured Jerusalem, right, which prompted many kings to sort of go into the Third Crusade, right? The First and the Second Crusade were also skirmishes where between the Sultanate and the um, and the uh, and the uh, and the Christendom, but they're not important for our context, so we're not going to discuss them. We are interested in the Third Crusade. Why? Because during the Third Crusade, the King Richard of England was prompted to join it, and he left as a consequence his brother in charge, who unsuccessfully tried to usurp power from the crusading king, his brother John, right? And of course, by consequence of it, he was a severely unpopular king, right? He's also presented as being very incapable, yada, yada, yada. I mean, if you've read Ivanhoe, or if you've read mm, Robin Hood, he features as a character in Robin Hood and all these. So where King John is said to be very anti-Robin Hood, and King Richard loved Robin Hood, etc., etc. I mean, the basic idea is that John was not a very liked figure. Richard was a very liked figure. Anyway, but after 1199, when King Richard died of a wound, of an arrow wound that developed into a gangrene, um, King John, he became the King John, right? And now, but despite his unpopularity, basically, so like a bunch of barons had like a lot of disagreements with John, and there was a conflict between them, in details of which we do not need to go to. But the end of that conflict is very important, because in the year 1215, King John was forced to sign the Magna Carta, right? Which sort of by law limited the power of the sovereign, right? And it's established a council of barons which is supposed to regulate stuff. We don't need to go into the details, right? But it was very important because it was the first instance where the power of the sovereign was limited constitutionally. It is very important, in the realm of political theory, and yeah, in general, the Magna Carta. I mean, Magna Carta, if we refer to something as a Magna Carta, we say that it's something, the first of its kind and of great significance, right? So the term is still in the today's lingo, right? Of course, Magna Carta, was dissolved by, Pope Clementine or Innocent. I'm forgetting. Anyway, I mean, it was later, dissolved, and then, there was a later constitution, etc., etc. You don't need to go into the details of that. But the idea of constitutionalism was sort of inceived in the in English monarchy, right? Which sort of continued with, tides and turns throughout the rest of the English history. Um, and this sort of led to a schism in in you know in political theory. On the one hand, we had people who believed that the political power of the state came from God, right? The divine right of the king, which is expressed very neatly in Shakespeare's play King Richard II. Not all the water in the rough root sea can wash the balm from an anointed king. The breath of worldly men cannot depose the deputy elected by the Lord. This is the basic idea of of the divine right, that if you sort of try to depose God, you're trying to depose God's will. which is not even treason, but also blasphemy, right? So yeah, this is the basic idea. And this sort of divine right theory was later is contrasted to this development of these, these views of constitutionalism, etc., which later developed into what we call the divine right theory, the divine right, that this constitution later developed into the social contract theory of political power, which we'll come to just in a second, right? um, Marcellus of Padua, who sort of was writing in the 12th century, is one of the most important thinkers of constitutionalism, right? And um, the he was sort of one of the first proponents of the theory that, the political power does not come from God, but is vested in the community and flows from the community, right? Uh, so the idea of contracts and corporations that were emerging at this time is very important. It led to some very 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 disparate changes in the way that we perceive political power and political authority. Today we relate the words corporation and contract to the realm of commerce, right? But of course, here we are talking about very different contracts and corporation, although the ideas are of course similar, right? What is a contract? Two people or a bunch of people just come and agree on something for their mutual interest, right? Something which can be enforced, right? Corporation is basically a body which is supposed to promote the interests of a group, right? And a person who heads a corporation does not work in their own interest, but in the interest of all the individual members. And if the individual members feel that the guy at the top is working against their interests, they can, they have all the recourses in the law to go against him. So these ideas were sort of developing, and it is important to take note uh, because of course we try to sort of delineate between the powers and the duties of the church and the state. The church had the duty for the eternal salvation of mankind. The duty of the state was to promote, to maintain peace on earth. But if you think about it, I mean, at the end of the day, church, whatever high goals it professes, is also an administrative body, right? It had to regulate itself in some manner. And questions, I mean, were in the administrative half of the church, the questions were abound in these questions. For example, what is the political authority of the pope? Whether the individual bishops have any impact over, whether they can question the authority of the pope. So these questions were also sort of coming up, and they were like causing this kind of schism, and were giving rise to this idea of community vested rights, etc. So Marcellus of Padua, in his work Dispenser Passus, counters the papal claim to political authority, right? Drawing from again the works of Aristotle. He discusses in detail what are the qualities of a good government, right? Here he doesn't argue, as people had before him argued, what are the ends of the good government, what goal should a good government pursue, but rather the quality. So what he's doing is not discussing the ends, but the means that a good government should adopt, right? He argues that the goal of a good government is to preserve, I mean, first he tries to argue, why do we need a government, right? He argues that to preserve life, it is important to preserve the community, and to preserve the community, it is important to preserve the state, right? And for the state to be preserved, a legitimate government should have certain attributes, right? Uh, the government should keep the state unified, and should have ultimate powers according to Marcellus. It should be ruled by laws. It must be made by the citizen body, and citizen body must have control over the government. And the ruler must be chosen by election and subject to correction, right? The church power must be controlled, and church membership to be subject to state control, right? So these were very, very powerful ideas that sort of that Marcellus was propounding here, that church was at the end of the day the member of the state, right? um, and he was able to propound this views. Of course, under ordinary circumstances, the views of Marcellus would have been labeled as blasphemy, and I mean, or heresy at least. And I mean, at the end of the day, he was able to do it because of he gained the patronage of King Ludwig of the Byzantine Empire, who was at that time in a conflict with the popes. So it was a huge skirmish between these two, between the church and the state. And because Marcellus was traveling along with Ludwig and was under his protection, he was able to espouse these ideas. So in the days preceding, I mean, before Marcellus, the church's political power was based on the premise of church's responsibility for man's supreme end, the eternal salvation of mankind, right? But Marcellus, because of his with his argument of necessary means rather than ends, tries to reach different conclusions, that it is not necessary for the church's goal of man's supreme eternal salvation. It is not necessary for them to have absolute political power, because they can do it within the framework of the state, being a part of the state, right? So Marcellus was the first medieval Aristotelian who used Aristotle's authority to argue that priesthood was part of the state, and it had massive impact on the theorists to come, who were slowly trying to be more bold in questioning the authority of the state, and trying to there was a move, of course, away from, which was not linear, of course. The move from the divine right theory to the social contract theory was not linear. Of course, there at all times there were people who were arguing for the community over God, and there were people who were claiming God over community, right? So it was not at all a very linear succession, and there were many theories at all times who were arguing from both sides, and we see how it is sort of played. But the overall arc that it shifts towards is that the community theory, the constitutionalism or the social contract gains prominence over time, while we see a decline of the divine right theory, right? Some of the very chief historical events that sort of led to the questioning of the authority of the state was, of course, Reformation, right? The context in which we are talking about, the 1400s, the 1500s, right? It was like even starting from the 1300s, because it was a very curious time, because at that time all the scriptures were written in Latin, because of course we're talking about, because they were written during the Roman period, etc. And the authority, the classical church was also deriving its authority from that culture, right? But the problem was that at this point of history, absolutely no one, and very few people actually spoke Latin, right? And because of that, people were not, in the sense that the teachings of the scriptures were being gate kept from the people, if you'd like to use the term, right? The scriptures were in Latin, the absolute authority was with the clergy, and whatever the clergy told you what the Bible means is what the Bible means, right? So the increasing tendency of the church to become dogmatic was clearly perceived, right? And in response to that, in the year 1517, a professor of moral theology at the University of Wittenberg posted a set of 95 academic disputations to the wall of All Saints Church in Wittenberg, kickstarting the Protestant Reformation. And we know him today as, of course, the great Martin Luther, right? And this kick started like a whole series of arguments between the Catholics and the Reformationists, and concluding in the Diet of Worms. I mean, the exact historical details I would love to go to, but unfortunately we don't have the time. So that was a thing that was happening in Europe at that time. And on the same spectrum, Henry VIII broke away from the Catholic Church after Pope Clement VII refused to sanction his marriage, right? And he established the Church of England and made changes in the English constitution that sort of reflected the idea of divine right of the king, right? He claimed absolute supremacy over both the state and the church, and he used treason and heresy to quell dissent, etc., etc. I mean, if you have read about Henry VIII, you'll know about what I'm talking about, right? Yes, and going from this, we see that there is a breakaway from, and there is a new set of theorists that are coming, who increasingly do not use God as a premise from which they argue for political authority, right? But of course, it flows from a sense of community, a want of stability in politics, and we'll see when we discuss, as you come to theorists like Machiavelli and Hobbes, we'll see how that sort of materializes in, right? So Machiavelli is described as one of the first practitioners of the modern science of politics, right? By many, he's also referred to as the father of modern political science. What was the contribution that Machiavelli sort of made to political theory that he's given these very heavy titles, right? Because at his time he was not very popular, and if you ask me, he's not very popular today either, right? People use Machiavellian to sort of indicate a very cunning, shrewd thinker, or a politician who sort of does not care about what are the means he adopts to get what he wants, right? But I mean, this image of Machiavelli is, of course, is flawed in some senses. I mean, of course, what Machiavelli was arguing was not like just pure devilry, but he is viewed as such. And yeah, we had many colorful comments by later theorists who talk about Machiavelli. I'd like to read you some. Machiavelli's The Prince is, of course, his most important work, and most of these comments derive from that work. Isaiah Berlin says, according to the most common view, Machiavelli was a man inspired by the devil to lead good men to their doom, the great subverter, the teacher of evil. Bertrand Russell viewed The Prince as the handbook of gangsters. And Berlin, once again said, and I quote, few would deny that Machiavelli's writing, more particularly The Prince, have scandalized mankind more deeply and continuously than any other political treatise. So what is there that is written in like The Prince that sort of rose people into such anger? So firstly, the main premise from which Machiavelli ensues is his idea about the subjectivity of virtue, right? Throughout, I mean, the antiquity and the Middle Ages, we are talking about philosophers who are talking about virtue, right? Aristotle's whole Nicomachean ethics is based on the idea of virtue, right? And it is the goal of the state to sort of promote virtue among men, right? And the idea of virtue then, of course, are accompanied by the idea of piety, the idea of faith, right? um, but but Machiavelli sort of tries to decouple virtue from God, right? And he tries to say that, okay, what is a virtuous act, right? I mean, what exactly do we call a virtuous act? By the subjectivity of virtue, he tries to argue that what you're trying to do, whether that act is virtuous or not, depends at the end of the day, at the end which you're aiming at, right? What is the end that you're aiming at? What is it trying to do, right? What is the right way of conduct depends on what you're trying to do. If you're trying to do if you're trying to destroy the world, then of course all the evil things for you are virtue, right? But of course we're not aiming towards these ends. What are the aims that a state rules towards? It is to maintain the stability, to maintain the integrity of a nation, right? And that is what the goals of a ruler should be. So Machiavelli's work, The Prince, is aimed to be a sort of a guide to a new young prince who has just become a ruler, how that ruler should conduct in order to promote you know in order to promote the prosperity of his state, right? That is basically what Machiavelli's work aimed at. And he says that when we are talking about the level of a ruler, um, we should not hold that ruler to the same level of virtue as the average man walking the street, right? What Machiavelli is trying to say is not that every person should be dishonest, every person should be uh, cunning, should not care about what evil he does to achieve his end. Of course not. That is not what is it fair to call founder of consequentialism? I don't think it will be okay to call him founder of consequentialism, because of course, as he talked about in the last to last lecture, we talked about Thucydides, right? Thucydides can be said to be, the founder of realist school of like international relations, or consequentialist school of politics. I think that the title most suitably goes to Thucydides. But again, in East and India, we had examples of Sun Tzu and Chanakya. So it is really difficult to sort of call one person, as a founder of any school of thought. Many ways people say that Bentham is the founder, or the true founder of utilitarian and consequentialism, because he's the first person who gave an elaborate theory, that sort of, elaborate theory that explains consequentialism from a metaphysical point of view, right? So again, I mean, depends on who you asked, who was the most important or the first figure in consequentialism. But yeah, he was a consequentialist. When you're talking about but he was consequentialist only in political matters. He was not, I won't say that he was a consequentialist in all general affairs of life, right? Um, so yeah, Machiavelli was very inspired by Roman history, right? And his other work, Discourses on Livy, just discusses Roman politics and Roman history, right? And tries to actually figure out what is it that makes states work or makes states fall, right? And what is Livy here? Discourses on Livy. Livy was a historian historian of Rome that lived around, I think, second or third century. I don't quite remember, but he lived not. I don't think this third century. He lived around the second century. Yeah, so he lived and wrote the history of Rome around that time. And the Discourses on Livy is basically, Machiavelli picking up parts of the Roman history and discussing what is happening here, and giving his philosophical reflections on them. And what he sort of noticed is that it is important for you know it is important for princes to be held at a different standard of virtue, because the things that they're doing, preserving the stability of the state, is very important, is very sensitive. And you cannot sort of expect a ruler to be held at same level of honesty, same level of virtue, same level of same level of morality as an average individual, right? Because look at any traditional commandments of morality. Like let's look at the Ten Commandments, like thou shalt not kill, right? But has there been any ruler in history who has not killed? I mean, of course, rulers go on war, rulers cause massive damage, but why does it happen? To promote the prosperity of the state at the end of the day, right? So this is from where Machiavelli is sort of arguing that the virtue of a prince is, at the end of the day, to maintain the stability of the state, right? And in this, I mean, while providing the stability of the state, he does not argue that a prince should be like just the absolute, should be an absolute tyrant, should go about killing anyone who sort of disagrees with them, because if he does that, then people will rise up in revolt, right? And if that is happening, then you did not do a very good job at maintaining stability, right? So it is a very sort of intricate sort of an equation that happens when a ruler is trying to make decisions. And it is based on these decisions, that we should, the nature of these decisions and the nature of the context in which rulers operate, that we should measure their morality, right? Measure the standards of the morality. And this is what basically he argues in The Prince, right? Again, the common parlance goes that he says that every person should do everything, should not care about morality, just do everything just to get what they want. This is not, absolutely not what Machiavelli is trying to say here, right? And this general parlance of Machiavelli is mostly by people who have not read The Prince. But yes, this is what Machiavelli tries to say. And on this, we base the actual beginning of the realist school of international politics finds its roots in Machiavelli, and sort of how Machiavelli, tries to paint a picture of how states work. And of course, we had a lot of, further, I mean, Machiavelli's was only the beginning, and we had many, many other theorists who sort of, change the dimensions of the way that we look at these things, etc. Especially after the formal, the institution of international relations as an academic field of study. That all you'll study in your second semester, so I don't need to get into too much detail right now. Anyway, yeah, so that was Machiavelli. And after Machiavelli, of course, we'll straight away jump to social contract, because this is what we're advancing towards, right? After all that is happening about, the rise of the community, the theory of political legitimacy of community, it was, of course, it was inevitable for social theories, social theorists to come up, social contract theorists to come up, because the historical tide was in this favor. And it's important to remember that, whenever a theorist sort of, propounds something, it is not absolutely an abstraction. The reason why I'm going so much into the detail of the historical context of the why in which these ideas are operating, because they influence it, right? Because you cannot theorize about something that absolutely does not match with anything that is happening in your political reality, right? Even if Thomas Aquinas wanted, he could not have sort of, laid down something like a social contract theory of hopes, because the time in which he was writing, it was just simply not possible. And people would have laughed that guy out of out of his academy, or probably executed him, right? So the context in which these theories are operating is very important, because it is in these context that they're trying to make sense of their own reality, right? And unless we know what reality is it that they're making sense of, it is no use learning these theories in abstract. So, and this is very important when we are trying to learn Hobbes, because Hobbes, the entire push of Hobbes' social contract theory is to rein in the instability that always troubles any state, right? Internal squabbles, civil wars, all these things that sort of sort of downgrade the quality of living of people. It is very important to sort of read Hobbes in this context, because this is what he was trying to rein through his idea of the Leviathan. We'll come to that just in a second, right? So Hobbes propounded first instance of what we call a social contract theory. Now, what does that mean, social contract theory? I've thrown around this word for a long time, but now we'll give it a formal definition. What is exactly a social contract, right? A social contract theory is basically a theory that proceeds from a view of specific view of human nature, and what problems would arise due to a specific view of human nature in absence of political authority. If there's no political authority, what are the problems that will arise? And it proceeds to give a specific form of government that is best suited to overcome the problems, right? So the absence of political authority is what social contract theorists refer to as the state of nature, right? It is not an actual time. It does not refer to any actual time where people could have lived in absence of political authority, but it is a rhetorical device in some senses. It is a what if situation, right? What if there is no political authority? What will happen? What will happen depends on human nature, right? How humans sort of and what are the natural tendencies of humans. Depending on that, uh, what we see is uh, the problems that arise in human nature then sort of lay the groundwork of what sort of government that we need, because whatever these problems are, these problems need to be quelled, and to quell these problems, basically a government exists, right? And the nature of the government can be defined henceforth. So this is basically the outline of what a social contract theory is. Now, who was Thomas Hobbes? Thomas Hobbes was an English writer, born in the year 1588, the same year as the Spanish Armada, right? So, of course, great political instability in the time that he was born, right? And he lived through the English Civil Wars, right? Which of course caused a lot of pain and a lot of suffering to a lot of people in England, because of the political stability, because of the instability that sort of ensues in absence of a strong political authority, right? So he's writing in this context, and it is important to see his work in this context, because it explains a lot as to why he placed value on the things that he placed value on, right? um Hobbes' most influential work was the Leviathan, published in the year 1651, right? And because of the civil war, he had moved to France, but he was again banished from France and had to return to England because the views that he espoused in Leviathan were deemed to be heretical. Now, Thomas Hobbes was what we today call a materialist. What type of materialist? An empiricist materialist. Now, what does that mean? Materialism is a specific metaphysical view that sort of says that um, that the world around us, like Plato and Aristotle had argued that the world consists of two things, right? Matter and form, right? Matter is basically what exists around us, and form is the idea, right? A metaphysical form that sort of gives that matter its qualities, right? Um, the materialist tradition, which has scholars like the ancient scholars like Democritus, Epicurus, on the other hand, believes that there is no matter, to separate matter and form, but there is only matter, right? And when you are a materialist, you would sort of reject all sort of dualistic ideas, including the existence of God in some senses, right? Because God is a dualist entity, right? Here is the material world. God exists in a transcendental world. So materials reject that. No, no, no. The all the reason and all the sense that you need to make from the world should flow from the material world. You should not look to anything above for an interpretation of the world around you, right? And he was an empiricist. What does that mean? Empiricist is the epistemological view. Big word. Epistemology basically means any theory of knowledge. How do we gain knowledge, right? So it is the epistemological view that says that all knowledge that we gain should be obtained from our senses, right? Now, empiricism, for example, Plato was not an empiricist. Plato was what we would call a rationalist, right? What does that mean? He believes that our senses are deceptive, and whatever we see around us, that will never give us a sense of the world, right? It never gives us a true sense of the world. It will only give us an image of the world that is flawed, and that is why we need to look to a reason to interpret truth, right? Plato said that that happens through uh, understanding the forms, right? The world of forms, to understand ideas through reason. Aristotle disagreed because Aristotle was an empiricist. He says, no, 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 no. The forms do not lie in a separate world. They are just all around us. And we, by observing them, by observing commonality of things, we can constitute forms, right? But he was not a materialist. He was an idealist, right? So both Plato and Aristotle were idealists. And they believed in these two theories, like form and matter, right? But Hobbes was an empiricist materialist, which means that he believes that true knowledge comes from observation, and he believes that there is no form and matter, but there is only matter, right? And what this view sort of pushes us to is, again, a theory of political authority, a theory of ethics, and a theory of political authority that does not look to God for its substantiation, right? Because even theorists like Marcellus of Padua, even though they gave elaborate theories about why the power should flow from community, did not reject God in some senses, right? They did not believe that God does not have any influence in human affairs, and that we do not need to interpret political authority through God, right? But Hobbes was one of the first people to do so, right? Some people describe him as an atheist, but it is a misleading term, because he was not an atheist who sort of said that I do not believe in God, right? The kind of atheist that he was the one who believes that whatever God concerned himself, the God's concern are in the afterlife, when the judgment is due, whatever, right? God should not and does not affect the lives of the human world, right? And the human world should be interpreted in human terms, right? He was, of course, one of the first and most important figures of what we today call enlightenment and humanism, right? Because the endeavors, the struggles, the value that humans attach to each other is something that you started gaining prominence in this period that we refer to as the Enlightenment, right? So it is very important to sort of think of think of thinkers like Hobbes and Locke in in this image, because they are enlightenment thinkers, and they're thinking in a period where our way of thinking is changing very rapidly, right? Hobbes lived in the era of scientific revolution of Francis Bacon. He was living alongside, great scientific theorists like Galileo, right? So of course, these ideas had an impact, a general impact in the way in which thought is being conducted, right? So um, Hobbes' most important work, the Leviathan, sort of lays the groundwork for his ideas, right? One of the most interesting things about the Leviathan is that it is a work that begins from a very basic, right? I mean, what Machiavelli did was to just present his ethical philosophy, as to, giving reasons from, history to sort of justify his ethical political views, right? But Hobbes is important because he argues from the very basic principles of philosophy, from the very basic principles of human nature. He tries to evolve his political theory. So he's arguing from the ground up. He's arguing from nothing to something, right? That is why he's very important philosopher. What Hobbes basically said, I'll just give you. I'm sure like Professor Maheshwar must have given you like a basic gist of Hobbes, but I'll just repeat them for your convenience, and you must have heard them in the podcast, right? Now I'm just repeating them for the sake of convenience, right? Hobbes believed that human nature is intrinsically selfish, right? And he believes that humans are innately selfish creatures who always work towards their own self-preservation, right, and can do anything for that end. And this particular view of human nature is how he is what he uses to interpret his idea of the state of nature, right? He says that if there is no state, what will evidently happen is that all the people will engage in a war against each other, right? And because the powers of each individual are more or less the same, right, there is no possibility that one of them can naturally conquer all the other and become the ruler, right? So what happens is that there is a state of perpetual conflict, and in the state of nature, Hobbes described in this very, very famous paragraph that in the state of nature, life is short, nasty, poor, and brutish, right? So to avoid what happens in this horrible state of nature, what Hobbes presents is that these people just come together and have and create a government, right? And the job of the government is basically to enforce what he calls a social contract, right? The social contract is basically that all these people who are independent, who are fighting for their self-preservation, they come together, surrender all their rights to harm principle. No, that is harm principle is Mill. You're confusing, I think, something here, Vishwash. Anyway, what Hobbes is saying here that all people come together, submit their powers to an individual government, right? An individual sovereign, not government. He used the word sovereign. Submit their powers to the sovereign and submit all their rights to the sovereign. And essentially, the sovereign sort of, may in return, what sovereign promises is their preservation, right? So the sole job of the sovereign is to preserve human life, right? And that is why he has to become the most powerful entity in any state, right? In any nation, whatever define the territorial boundary as. Now, in his book is named Leviathan because he argues that a sovereign should be like a leviathan. Now, what is a leviathan? Leviathan is a mythical beast from the Bible, which has very scary, monstrous features, which is very powerful, like a dragon or something, right? Um, I don't know what the exact description of a leviathan is, but basically, it is a very powerful being, right? So, if sort of if you had to look, up to any kind of ruler who should who should preserve your life, the perfect form of the perfect ruler is akin to a leviathan, is what Hobbes argues, who's so powerful, who has so many and who's basically powerful than any other individual in a state, so that he can preserve their existence. Now, to argue for a state of nature, he gives, of course, many examples. For example, he gives the example of international relations. Of course, he did not use this word, but how states conduct themselves, right? So he says that international order is basically a state, is an example of a state of nature, because there is no universal king who rules all men. What happens is that individual nations are always at war with each other, right? And that is how he explains how why, all these countries are at war with each other, because there's no superseding sovereign. So these countries sort of exist in a state of nature, and we see that they're in perpetual war. And why should we assume that individuals, if left to their own devices, should be any different, right? And of course, this is a part of Hobbes' philosophy that has come to most vehement critique by later thinkers. But we'll get to that, I think, in a bit, when we discuss Locke, who propounds a very different idea of human nature. But yeah, this is basically what Hobbes' idea of human nature, that they're inherently selfish. Whether they're inherently selfish or not, it's a question that is discovered in great detail by later thinkers, but we'll come to that when we will. For now, we are discussing Hobbes, and let us discuss what are the consequences of this particular idea of the state, or of the power, the unlimited powers of a sovereign. When you sort of surrender all your rights to like a sovereign, what you have is a state where citizens have virtually no rights, right? There is nothing stopping from the ruler from making the lives of its people miserable, right? All it needs to do is to act, just do the bare minimum of preserving life, and with that, the sovereign has a clean sheet to do whatever he does, according to Hobbes. Right, of course, but Hobbes' intention was not that the king should be very, merciless ruler. I mean, of course, that's not his intention. But he gives the example of what is happening in England at the time that he was writing this. There was a civil war, right? Where every ruler was claiming that they are the just ruler, and it was entire conflict that was happening. He said that, hey, better than this, whatever, even if there's a strong central authority that is ruling, even if that authority's rule is unjust, it is still better than the short, nasty, poor and brutish life that you would actually have in a state of nature, right? So it is better for us, according to Hobbes, it is better for us to submit to a sovereign authority, uh, submit all our rights to sovereign authority, even though their rule is not the ideal, it is still better than the state of nature, right? So this is what basically Hobbes' political authorities. And of course, critics feel that he presents his views in too much of an extreme, right? And yeah, that is a valid criticism that is laid down in by Hobbes, but we should all recognize him for the kind of uh, the kind of the kind of contribution that Hobbes made to political theory. Yeah. Basically. So the kind of contribution that Hobbes made to political theory, he basically laid down the foundation of the liberal theory, right, which is individualist, right, which flows from the individual, because we see that here the ideas of social contract are not flowing from either God or the community, but from the individual, right? And that is the basic essence of what liberal theory is. It focuses on the individual and flows from the individual, right? It is not liberal in the sense that the partisan liberal politics that we look at, that liberals and conservatives in US. Of course, it is a very different, it is theoretical liberalism, if you may, right? um, Paul W. Kahn, a very interesting author that I think you will encounter in your second semester, talks about three sort of liberalism. First is the liberal theory that talks about the individual, flows from individual moral consideration. There is a liberal culture, right, which views individual as important and focuses on individual rights. Like you see in USA, the liberal culture there is very prevalent. And third is the partisan political practice of liberalism, that that we oppose to conservative politics, right? So these things are very different, and I mean they're related in some senses, because one sort of uh, one sort of influences the other, but of course they're distinct. And when we talk about liberalism, we're talking about the theoretical ideas of liberalism, right? Which Thomas Hobbes sort of engendered, and which is later taken by Hobbes, by Locke and Rousseau. Right. So that was basically a basic introduction of who who Hobbes was, right? And the next thinker that, of course, we encounter in this tradition is John Locke, right? John Locke was writing around. I think his book came out in, the Second Treatise of Government, I think, came out in 1689, and the Leviathan came out in 1651. So there's like 30 to 40 years of gap between these two thinkers. Um, and he was also living through the time that, Hobbes was living through. Hobbes died earlier, of course. Locke sort of continued living after. He witnessed the Civil War in his early years, then witnessed the Interregnum, the Restoration, the Exclusion Crisis, and the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which, if I had the time, I would love to go into the juicy details of, but unfortunately we cannot. So I will just pick up from the Glorious Revolution of 1688, right? The Glorious Revolution of 1688 was basically a Dutch intervention into English politics, where the King James was replaced by Queen Mary II and his husband William of Orange, right? And they sort of became the monarch. And in his treatises of the government, uh, John Locke lays out his sort of his goal, because of course a king is deposed by another king, right? There is of course a crisis of legitimation, right? There is a crisis of political legitimacy, because I mean, same ideas of divine right, right? You cannot remove the deputy of the god, because that is blasphemy, that is against going against the will of God, right? So while writing his treatises on the government, John Locke sort of states his goal as follows, and I quote: to establish the throne of our great restorer, our present King William, to make good his title in consent of the people, which being the only of the lawful governments, he has more fully and clearly than any other prince in Christendom, and to justify the world, the people of England, whose love of their just and natural rights and their resolution to preserve them, saved the nation when it was at the brink of slavery and ruin. This is what Jean Locke describes as the goal of his treatises of government. Now, some other contemporary theorists who were writing in that time was another contemporary thinker who was writing at that time was Robert Filmer. Now, Robert Filmer was writing after Hobbes, and he was a theorist who was promoting the divine right theory of king, right? And Filmer greatly criticizes Hobbes and other thinkers like Grotius and all the thinkers of that time, and he was trying to argue for the or for the divine right of the king. Locke criticized Filmer in very vehement terms, and to the extent that we today remember Filmer only for Locke's sort of destruction of his arguments. So Locke writes the two treatises of the government, right? The first treatise is a criticism of the divine right theory and a criticism of Robert Filmer's view, right? The second treatise, he lays out his own ideas of the government, right? His ideas of what human nature is, how people are in the state of nature, and what is the sort of government that we sort of require to fix the sort of evils that the state of nature presents us, right? um, John Locke states that in the state of nature, there is, of course, no government. So there is a sort of an apolitical society that, that exists. But even in this apolitical society, it is not that, that an individual is without any rights, right? He argues for three rights that are provided to an individual by God: the right to life, liberty, property. very important terms which sort of greatly influenced the French Revolution, greatly influenced the American Revolution. And these terms, life, liberty, and property, find themselves like thrown across these liberal constitutions that came up later, right? So the importance of the views of John Locke cannot be undermined, because in many ways they're still trying, the views of John Locke are still informing our politics to a great extent, right? The Constitution of United States, after which many of the liberal constitution were sort of modeled, it talks about life, liberty, and property. And even our Article 21, where we talked about no person shall be deprived of his life, right to life or liberty, save by the saved by the provisions of the law, right? Saved by the procedure established by law. I apologize. So no. I am coming to John Locke's idea of the state of nature. So John Locke's idea of state of nature is not as bad as Thomas Hobbes. Right? Thomas Hobbes describes that your state of nature is just terrible. Everyone is just killing each other on their own, whatever. Right? John Locke, on the other hand, it paints a comparatively more natural picture, comparatively more brighter picture of the state of nature. Right? It isn't as overtly positive as Rousseau. Rousseau, to matlab, he was all about, oh no, everything was just great. When it was state of nature, everyone was just chilling and living a happy life. It is only because of the government that we had amour proprie and all these ideas, and basically evil men sort of made alienated humans from their nature, and sort of led to all the evils that affect our world. He was not sort of to that extent. He was not he was not charmed by the state of nature to that effect, but he describes that state of nature had some of their positives and has their negatives, right? In the state of nature, all of these rights of life, liberty, and property are available to people to the greatest extent, right? Life, of course, people have the life. Liberty, people have liberty. It is understandable, but property needs some explanation, because we see property as a human construct, right? So how does it exist in the state of nature? Jean Locke argues it through what we today refer to as the labor theory of property, right? So this property, if I had to give a basically a formula of property, it would be natural resources plus human labor is equals to property, is what we would call the labor theory of property. So what basically he says that all the natural resources of the world are given in abundance to us, right? But these natural resources are only converted to property when we apply some labor to it, right? And it is just for us to claim what we have applied a labor to. For example, a tree exists in the nature, right? But if a man chops that tree and makes a table out of it, it is just for him to consider that table his property. The vineyards, I mean, grapes grow in the nature, right? But when a man picks that grape and ferments it and makes a wine out of it, that man can consider wine as his property, right? So this is basically labor theory of property, which is, of course, as you will understand, criticized greatly by later thinkers, Kaf Marx, right? This is basically the labor theory of property as far as Locke is concerned. And life, liberty, and property are the three rights that, as per Locke, are guaranteed. Okay, I think we're 8:05. I'll take 10 more minutes and then we'll end the class. Okay, so life, liberty, and property are the three rights that are guaranteed to humans by God, according to the state of, according to in the state of nature. Now, God, by the mention of the word God, he must understand that Locke is not a materialist like Hobbes. He's, of course, basing the foundation of his arguments on God, but his idea of God is very different from the divine right theorist or the papacy, right? He of course, Locke is an idealist, but at the same time he's an empiricist. So in some respect you can you can compare him to Aristotle, but not really. Just because these two labels are the same doesn't mean that the content of their views is the same, right? Locke's empiricism was different from Aristotle's empiricism or Hobbes' empiricism. And I mean, I can go into depth about his epistemological theory of empiricism, but I don't think that necessary. If you are interested, go to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and read about it. Yeah, so he was an empiricist idealist, right? And he was arguing from the premise that God sort of gave life, liberty, and property to all humans in abundance. And but the problem with the state of nature is that humans are, humans are can be subjected to harm, right, in the state of nature. And and there is a need to sort of organize a community to properly administer the rights of life, liberty, and property, because then the property of one person, these rights of one person will come in conflict with each other, right? So, for example, my liberty to shoot you and end your life is coming in conflict with my liberty to shoot you and kill you is coming into conflict with your right to life, right? So my right to liberty, my and their right to life, it's coming in conflict with each other. So of course, these rights will come in conflict in absence of a state, is what Locke is trying to argue here, right? And the evils of this state of nature can be avoided if we have a state which can interpret the rights of right, liberty, and property in a just manner, so that the citizens can prosper, right? So unlike Hobbes, he's not arguing that we surrender all the rights to the state and we sort of just obey it, closed eyes, and just go along as we do because there is nothing else we can do about it. uh, Locke argues that every person has inherent in them the right to life, liberty, and property, and the state cannot unjustly take away these rights. And if the state takes away these rights, the citizens have the right to protest. Citizens have the right to throw away that government. Very, very important. Very, very important. Laid laid the groundwork of the French Revolution. Very important, right? And of course, the American Revolution. Um, because they argued that because they believed that the reign of King Louis the 16th is unjust, they were able to overthrow King Louis the 15th, because the Americans believed that the reign of British is unjust and the taxes that they're laying on them is unjust. Because what they were doing, these taxes were unjustly taking away the Americans people's right to property, right? And they're depriving them of the natural rights, and hence they had the authority to overthrow this government, right? The British government. Very, very important. Can Locke be classified as anti-monarchy? Not at all, bro. I mean, we just read that the two treatises of the government was sort of a defense of the new royal order, right, against the old. So Locke was not against monarchy. Locke was against unjust use of sovereign authority, right? It was Montesquieu who sort of advocated for separation of powers, who sort of advocated for, parliamentary democracy, etc., etc. But that was not Locke. That was not Locke. I mean, Locke was fine with monarchy as long as there is justice in that monarchy and the rights of the citizens are not unjustly limited. Yeah, he was against despotism. You can say that. He was against, of course, every no political thinker would argue that that despotism is allowed. Of course, everyone's definition of what despotism and tyranny is different, right? Aquinas believed that tyranny is basically when the human laws of a sovereign are not in conformity with the natural laws inferred from the eternal law, right? um, and for Hobbes, it is basically when state just straight away just starts killing the citizens, right? I mean, without any semblance of order, right? Where life itself is threatened and life is no longer preserved. It is only then that the sovereign steps out of the social contract, and then it is only then that any consequences can be laid on it. And of course, there is no evidence of Hobbes like sort of promoting any sort of revolutionary theory. And he was absolutely in sort of in agreement to lay obedience to the sovereign. But Locke, on the other hand, just goes ahead and says that you only need to obey the ruler as long as that ruler is respecting your rights to life, liberty, and property. So I think, yeah, we have come to the end of these three grueling classes with this. Thank you everyone for being with us on this journey. And thank you very much for just coming here just a day before the exam. I know that you must have been very busy and you must have been, busy with the preparation, etc. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you to Professor Maheshwar for allowing me to take these extra classes. And yeah, best of luck for your exams, I think. I'll stop the recording now.